In this talk, we're looking at LeCorbusier as a theoretician and as a practitioner. And maybe you know, maybe don't know, but he wrote many books actually in his career. Toward a New Architecture was the first and probably the most influential, but he continued to write all the way through his career. And of course, he was a prolific designer. But as we mentioned in that first talk, wow, to take 4 years out in a kind of prime years of your career and say, I'm going to really concentrate on theory, that really marked him very distinctively as an important theoretician as well as a practitioner. So here is Le Corbusier when he's in his 40s, right there. And that is actually in his painting studio in his apartment on Nunez-Colis, which is the one I mentioned that I lived in for a while. And it's very interesting to see that stone wall. Maybe not what you think of as Le Corbusier. This is his own house. And he has a painting studio in the front, and he lives in the back of that house. And it's got a very, very rugged feeling to it. That would have been him in his 40s, and then this is him in his 60s. The mature, very, very famous at that point, Le Corbusier. We mentioned in the last talk his early career in La Chaux-de-Fonds and this self-taught architect. He gets this tremendous opportunity when he's 20 years old. His teacher, Charles Leplantier, had a friend who wanted a house. And he recommended to the friend that he let Le Corbusier design his house because he knew this guy was striving to be an architect. So this young guy and a couple of his buddies designed the Villa Fallet for one of Charles Leplantiers' good friends. Now, it is very much the kind of house you see all over in this region of Switzerland. It's called an Emmental house, named after the region. But that roof shape and the really steep alpine roofs, the red tile, all of this is classic vernacular kind of architecture that's in this region. So he's just adopting what he's familiar with to a large extent. But the place where there is some innovation is right through here. And Charles Leplantier, of course, would have been this guy who's exposing him to Jugendstil and some of these Art Nouveau kinds of expressions. And in them, there's a lot of really interesting dialogue about ornament, and especially geometricized ornament. So he would have been looking at people like Joseph Hoffmann, who did these very geometricized ornament pieces. And he's looking at the Secession, and he's looking at these architects that Leplantier had been introducing to him. So it is, in macro sense, it's an Emmental house. But then in detail, it's showing just that little bit of edge of innovation and new thinking. Then on the basis of that, he got commissions to do the Villa Jacquemet in the same neighborhood and the Villa Stotzer in the same neighborhood. So at a very, very young age, he's getting these opportunities to build. And then as we talked about last time, he's doing this self-education all of this time. And he's taking these trips. And after he comes back from his second long trip, he gets the opportunity to do a house for his father, the Villa Jean Pere. And that one is done in La Chaux-de-Fonds, not so far from those other 3 houses. And in it, he is showing maybe a little bit different direction. So those were very much the kind of house you saw all over in this region. This one, he's now worked for Auguste Perret. He's gone to Berlin and worked for Peter Behrens. And he's a much more educated architect. And he's looking around at innovative building that interest him around. And for this house for his father, he's looking at the Winslow house. And you can see the same treatment of the upstairs windows, the kind of dominance of the lower floor, the sort of living room functions there, and then taking the sill of the upper floor to make this kind of attic where the bedrooms are, that major kind of frontispiece, creating an axis in the center of the building there, the even distribution of windows around, even this little bay window thing there. On the other side of the Winslow house, you can't see it in this photograph, but there's a similar kind of bay window. That bay window is where the dining room is, and the dining room table is sitting in that bay window. And the same here on the lower floor, that's the dining room, and the dining room table is sitting in that bay window. Now, definitely Le Corbusier is learning from Auguste Perret. He's learning from Peter Behrens. He's learning from Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, there's a real interesting connection here. Frank Lloyd Wright left the United States in 1908 and ran away with his client's wife, Mama Cheney, and went to Berlin. And he spent several years there redrawing his early prairie-style houses and making a folio book that was referred to as the Wasmuth Portfolio. Wasmuth was the publishing company. So he is doing the Wasmuth Portfolio, and it's published in Germany in about 1909, 1910. That's exactly when Le Corbusier is in Berlin working for Peter Behrens. And the Winslow house was in that Wasmuth Portfolio. So Le Corbusier's got the feelers out. He's looking for interesting, innovative work that's being done all around the world. He then, as I mentioned, goes back to Le Chaux de Fonds after that foray around Paris and Berlin, and then the trip in 1911. And he does, along with his father's house, he does the Villa Schwab. And the Villa Schwab was for this wealthy person. It was a much more grand and important house than the one for his father. And in it, he is seeing a lot of the influence he's picking up, just like he's picking that up from Frank Lloyd Wright. There's a great deal of Auguste Perret here. Perret was fond of that kind of window. You can see the reinforced concrete frame that Auguste Perret was known for. You can see these primaries, the sort of geometrical volumes, the cube, the half cylinder. So he's picking up on some of these ideas that he's finding in Auguste Perret and other places. Very different expression in the concrete than in steel, where the steel becomes these slender, tiny little columns, understanding what steel can do there and how different it is from concrete. All of the proportions in the building are very mathematically derived. So he's using the golden section vertically there, the golden section horizontally here. He's putting all kinds of regulating lines across that to mathematically proportion the building. And then a spatial sense that is completely different from what he had done in the Villa Jean-Henri Perret, certainly different than the Villa Farley or the Villa Stotzer. Now this big open space bathed in light. He's beginning to find ideas and directions that the concrete frame enabled him to do that couldn't be done in more conventional construction, and that allow him to bring in natural light in a way that he's beginning to see as a major force in his architecture. Now, at that point, he's beginning to really have a theory of architecture, just beginning. And I want to, again, refer to our notes that you got. And we'll be going through, again, 6 points that he finds very important and looking at buildings that he's doing at the same time, pretty much, as he's writing the book. In the beginning, we'll be looking at that, and then we'll kind of progress to other parts of his career. But one of the things that's very, very strong in the book is this notion of an admiration for engineering and for an analytical way of thinking. And a very fundamental part of his theory is that we should be learning from that analytical way of thinking. So he says, for example, the engineer inspired by the law of economy and governed by mathematical calculation, puts us in accord with universal law. So it's not engineering for the sake of engineering. It's that engineering and the understanding of physics and gravity and all of those natural forces, that puts us in concert with universal law and with natural law. He says, standards are a matter of logic, analysis, and minute study. They are based on a problem that has been well stated. A standard is definitely established by experiment. So you're constantly analyzing, understanding, experimenting as a scientist does, as an engineer does. And he feels like this is a way of getting a connection to the way nature works in a more scientific and a more rational and a more analytical way. So in this era, when he is doing the Villa Schwab, and he's also doing some other experiments. And again, self-taught guy, right? So he comes up with this notion that he calls the maison domino. He's thinking there must be a more systematized way of building, especially building large, especially housing projects. There must be a more systematized way of building. And this is a domino, like a domino you would link together. This is a building block. And he's thinking of it in an engineering sense. How could it use these new materials of reinforced concrete to do that? And it's hard to explain in a small amount of time how innovative this idea was. Prior to this time, if you thought of making a concrete frame, you would have had columns and beams and slabs that spanned between. But in this case, he's realizing that you can concentrate the reinforcing in different ways in different parts of the slab to not have any beams, to just have a flat slab like that. Now that was a fundamental innovation in concrete. And probably, his exposure to concrete in Paris was an opportunity for him to really rethink this material. And he's thinking of it in an analytical way. How can it be the most flexible so that it can make a systematic way of building? Now, he takes out a patent on that. And that patent makes him a lot of money because he's really rethinking how you do reinforced concrete and in many ways inventing the flat slab. He also does this little experiment over here, which is again about how you build, about systematized building. This one is that was the Maison Domino. This one's called the Villa Citroën. And the Citroën refers to the largest automobile maker in France at the time was Citroën. And they made luxurious cars, but they also made a very stock standard every man's car called the Deux Chevaux. And they were kind of famous for being able to just make an inexpensive car that everybody can afford. And so he's thinking he's making the Maison Citroën here, kind of the Deux Chevaux of architecture. Deux Chevaux means literally in French, 2 horses. Just a very fundamental car, very fundamental. So he's making a house that just has the living room, dining room, kitchen, kind of maid's quarter back here. On the second floor, it has the master bedroom with a double height space overlooking the living room. On the third floor, it's got the smaller bedrooms going out to a roof terrace. And then that's solarium on the top there. And the whole end of it is then glass, but party walls on the side so you can stack them together. And he was looking for, how can I make this thing that is easily replicable like an automobile and that is available to every man, very gracious, wonderful sense of space, beautiful sense of light, but very, very simple and fundamental like the Deux Chevaux. And pretty amazing idea at the time. He also is trying to think analytically, think rationally. And he develops what he calls the 5 points of architecture. And he actually publishes a book on the 5 points. And the 5 points have to do with, let's get rid of the stupidity in building and construction, and let's think of it more rationally. So he says we used to have solid masonry walls holding up the ceilings. That's the old structural system. Now we can just have columns. So that allows us to have the free plan. Room dividers can be anywhere. They don't have to be according to a structural system. So it allows us to have the free plan. Then also we can have now the free facade. An old building had to have regular windows and the weights had to be brought down periodically there. But a new building, because the forces are carried on columns, now the facade can be lightweight and free. It can be all glass, it can be ribbon windows, it's got a lot more freedom. So the first is the free plan, the second is the free facade, the third is the ribbon window. Why do we make windows like this? They're just glary little spots against a dark wall that gets no light. Better to let the light come in and bounce off of the side walls there and distribute the light more evenly in the room. And a ribbon window makes so much sense. Why do my knee doesn't need to see out? The window needs to be between my height when I'm sitting and where my eyeballs are, and my height where I'm standing and where my eyeballs are. That's where the window needs to be, and it needs to have light bouncing off of the walls of the room. So that's a logical window arrangement. That's the third point. The fourth one is don't do stupid basements. They're dank, they're damp, they're dark, they're ugly. You should instead put the building up on pilotis. It should rise up above the ground and allow the ground to go through, and you can continue to have greenery and vegetation there. But raising the building on pilotis, very important idea for him. And then the fifth is no attics, no stupid, dumb attics that are wasted space and the claptrap collects there. Instead, you should have roof gardens up on the top of buildings to, again, reassert the ground that you lost when you made the building down here. So those are the 5 points: the free plan, the free facade, the ribbon window, pilotis instead of basements, and gardens instead of roofs and attics. So again, this is just a way of thinking. I need to think analytically when I design buildings. Now, out of all of that theory for 4 years, where he's getting all these ideas and he's writing toward a new architecture, then in 1923, he gets his first commission after this, which is the Villa La Roche, sometimes called the Maison La Roche Jeanneret, because the end of it, this end is the La Roche house, this end is the Jeanneret house. It was at the end of a little bitty street called the Square du Docteur Blanche, off of a major street called Docteur Blanche, and this in the 16th arrondissement, very chic part in the western part of Paris. So it's in a nice little cul-de-sac down there. As I said, the Maison La Roche here, the Maison Jeanneret right here. This would have been, the Jeanneret part is his family. He also is doing this with his cousin, Pierre Jeanneret, who was his architectural partner for most of his career. He was Charles-Édouard Jeanneret until about this time, when he starts to write for L'Esprit Nouveau. He calls himself LeCorbusier, and that becomes his nom de plume, and he subsequently is known as Le Corbusier. So let's see how those 5 points work out. We can see the building up on pilotis here, so that the garden goes right under the building. We can see the free plan, where all of the partitions are just where they need to be, but not on any sort of structural basis. We see the free facade, where I can make windows of whatever size and shape they need to be for functional reasons, and I don't need to have them all lined up on the facade. So we have the pilotis, we see the free plan, the free facade, obviously the ribbon window through here, and then also the roof garden on the top, as you can see in the slide on the left. In plan, this is the Maison Jeanneret on that end, the Maison La Roche on that end. We'll be looking primarily at the Maison La Roche and at the entry, which happens right there. So this is coming in from that courtyard. Courtyard right here, you go through the front door, under a bridge, and into the entry hall, which you can see in his sketch right there, or in reality right there. I'm always a little, it makes me giggle how much the sketches don't really describe the space. LeCorbusier sketches generally don't. They're a kind of notion, but the proportions and so on are very, very seldom true. This one looks like it's a mammoth room. In fact, it's quite a small and intimate room. But you come into that entry hall, you go up to the major level of the house, which is kind of piano nobile with a living room, and across this bridge into the dining room. The lower level would have been garage and concierge quarters. On that second floor, you go into the living room there, or you can follow that stair on up, and there's a little studio at the top up there. You could have gone the other direction on that bridge, and you come to the dining room here, and the dining room has that ribbon window that wraps around the corner and gives you view at just the right height for your eye. All the way through, everything, including like light fixtures. That engineering mentality. What is a light fixture? What does it need to do? I'm not making a freaking chandelier here. I'm making a light fixture. And how can it do that most efficiently? And how does that really work with the rest of the room as a light fixture? And the light fixtures in the building are really, I think, really cool. This is in that living room. Again, the kind of free plan, defined in part by furniture. All of that furniture shown here would have been furniture designed by LeCorbusier. Again, his sketch of that room and the reality of how that living room looks. It actually is, as it's noted here, it's a gallery of paintings. Monsieur Laroche was a very famous art collector, an early collector of Picasso and Braque and other very famous Parisian painters. So he's making lots of wall here for the paintings, and then the windows are very high, letting in a soft light up above. There you can see that clear story window and lighting that was very appropriate to light the paintings. There's another of my favorite light fixtures, that conduit that comes out and bang, has a bulb on the end of it. What is a light fixture? When I need that light out in the middle of the room, that's how I provide it. Okay, this is Le Corbusier at the time he's writing toward a new architecture. Is he following this dictum that the engineer and an analytical way of thinking should inspire the way we do architecture? We'll be having this discussion, and I want you to be thinking about where did that come from? Do I agree with that? What kind of architecture does that make? Did that make in the case of Le Corbusier? Okay, a second point he makes is on harmony and abstraction. Let me read a couple of quotes. He says, architectural abstraction has this about it, which is magnificently peculiar to itself, that while it is rooted in hard fact, it spiritualizes it. So by abstracting something, you spiritualize it. You make it more emotional. So you take that rational thought, but in the process of abstraction, you make it more spiritual. Another quote, he says, axes, circles, right angles are geometrical truths and give results that our eyes can measure and recognize, whereas otherwise there would be only chance, irregularity, and capriciousness. So he's saying there are some of these geometrical principles that make our eye immediately drawn to it, that we have a response to it that is not the same as if it's irregular or capricious. So about the same time he's doing the Maison La Roche-Jeanneray, a few years later, he's doing the Villa Stein, and I think it exemplifies this notion of abstraction and geometrical purity very well. So this was done for Gertrude Stein, very famous American writer who was living in Paris. All the sort of cognoscenti of the radical art scene went to Gertrude Stein's house. So this became quite an appropriate literary scene in Paris. And all the things he's talking about, that geometric clarity, the axis, the symmetry, the sort of major guest door here, the major family door there. All of that, he's saying that you take the rational idea we've just been talking about, but now you abstract it and you give it those axes and geometry, and it spiritualizes it. It makes it even more emotionally appropriate. And this is a beautiful house in terms of the way it actually works. The front has that great regularity. On the back, it has a beautiful garden. There's a huge double height kind of outdoor room here that spills out to the garden. But throughout the whole thing, there are all of these pure, clear geometries. The half cylinder, again, that we saw him employ earlier. The very strict proportioning. All of this, he said, this abstraction spiritualizes the building and makes it more accessible to our heart and to our feelings. So a third point in the theory of Le Corbusier that is there in the notes is his attitudes toward materials and methods. And we've already talked a little bit about his very strong interest in construction and about the way things are put together and how that should be a major force in shaping architecture. A quote or two, he says, "In the last 50 years, steel and concrete have brought new conquests, which are the index of a greater capacity for construction and of an architecture in which the old codes have been overturned." He talks about, and maybe this is something we'd have a hard time saying, but that natural materials like natural wood, it warps and it twists and it cracks, and it's inferior to these more manufactured products like steel and concrete. A big advocate of the advances in technology that have allowed for those materials to be prevalent materials in architecture. And a great example of that would be the Villa Savoye, probably his most famous house of the era, done in 1928. And it certainly has those qualities of abstraction and geometry, and that kind of spiritualizing this logic of how a building's put together. It certainly has the 5 points up on pilotis, the ribbon windows, a very beautiful roof garden, the open plan, the open facade. All of those things are embedded in the building. And then this effort to kind of spiritualize it by using pure, clear geometries and abstraction that gives it a kind of ethereal quality to it. It was on a site that was a big open field, and around it were trees all the way around. Now it's urbanized a little bit, but it was a beautiful site where it sat as a kind of jewel in the midst of this natural clearing in the woods. And it would originally have had the roof garden treated in a distinctly different color than the bulk of the building. Very interesting how this is all extremely rational. It's all about getting the car in and out. It's about interface with the automobile. Le Corbusier loved automobiles. It becomes a part of the house, very unabashedly, the house sort of gesturing to the function of bringing in and out the automobile. Again, this abstraction, these geometrical forms in the stairwells as you're going, in this case, from the lower floor up to the main floor of the building. And then all the way through it, this clear, simple abstraction of planes and forms with light animating it. You can either rise through the stair or you can go through a ramp that takes you all the way from the bottom to the roof terrace of the building. Upstairs there is a huge courtyard, and the living room looks onto that courtyard, an enormous sliding glass wall that just opens up the room to that courtyard and then to the roof terrace off of that. Incredible connectivity to nature that happens here. And then all the way around that ribbon window that originally would have let you see this row of trees around. Now, as you can see, a little more urban view out there. Again, really rationally thinking through the bathroom and all of those functions of the bathroom and celebrating those as a place to bathe and then a place for ablutions and a place to lie in the sun and catch the sun's rays even, in the wintertime. All of it kind of thinking through the process of bathing. This guy was a very physical guy. He was a swimmer, and near his house was the Piscine Molitor. Went there every day, very worked out, loved the water. He had a summer place on the Mediterranean where he swam in the Mediterranean. So all of that kind of physical, life of a person expressed in a kind of really quite rational bathroom there. So you can see all those expressed in the plan. You would have driven the car in like that and gone into the garage, pulled out, and exited like that. So all of that within the pilotis that are raising the building up. There'd also be a little concierge apartment down on that lower floor. Then you would have come either via the stair or the ramp up to the second floor with its big living room, where we looked out that glass door to the big courtyard there. The kitchen serving into the dining and living room there. 3 bedrooms back over here and a little study. And then extensive gardens up on the roof up there that would be accessible primarily by that big ramp. So again, rational, taking full advantage of the free plan and the free elevation that this new material of concrete allows. But really the concrete being the key here. And that notion of the maison domino and the ability of the concrete to behave in this way allows you to have these massive pieces of glass that open onto an outdoor space, allows you to have the freedom in plan, allows you to integrate the car as directly as he does. It is really this innovation of material and of structural system that's allowing all that to happen. Now, at this moment, I want to reflect back a little bit, because I think LeCorbusier reflected back a little bit. So he had this very, very rational thought for quite a long time. And then he gets this opportunity. That's a tremendous opportunity. He always wanted to do workers' housing. He would do houses for rich people, but he really, really wanted to do worker housing. And so there was a guy who owned a factory near Bordeaux, and he wanted to build housing for his employees. And he read some of Le Corbusier's ideas, as you've seen in Toward a New Architecture. And he hired Le Corbusier to do this housing for workers in his factory in Pessac. Very socially enlightened kind of project. And so Le Corbusier is using all of these things that he's been thinking, all the way from the Maison Domino, the Maison Citroën, trying to build this very utilitarian but very gracious place for these employees to work. So he builds this worker housing at Pessac. And it was actually his patron who said, I like everything you're talking about, but we need a little color on it. So Le Corbusier selected these colors. That's really true to the color of all of the buildings originally. I was at Pessac last summer. Oh my God, this was really interesting to see it in its current stage. So this would be, all of these are Le Corbusier's housing at Pessac all the way through here. That street is all perfectly intact. These are Le Corbusier's, there's a different type of housing that's back over here. Total of about 50 units of worker housing. And this is now called Rue Le Corbusier after him. This was a model that he built originally. They still have it there. And you can see how the color was very important. But it was also these kind of repetitive, in a way, the Maison Citran. Many of those ideas are built into it, made of reinforced concrete. Roof gardens up on pilotis, so you have gardens on the lower floor there. The free plan, the free facade, the ribbon window, all of those things, the abstraction, the kind of spiritualizing of that. He's really given the opportunity to do everything he wanted. And then, much to his chagrin, the workers moved in, and in a very short period of time, they undid a lot of what he had done. So they took the ribbon windows out, and they made windows they were more accustomed to, and put fake shutters on them. They cropped off the corners of the windows to make them seem a little archy. They changed the profile of the roof, sometimes alluding to it being a sloped roof and having tile on it. They closed up a lot of the outdoor spaces that were on the ground floor. This is actually a drawing that was done of what happened shortly afterwards. And you can still see remnants of that. There still are some of those units. This one is, they turned the ribbon window into punched windows, put shutters on it, and put a kind of fake tile roof across the top. And then some of the units have been converted back again, so that they're back to the authentic colors and done really exactly like they were originally in the 1920s. I just love the accent of being able to take this photograph. That is a Duchavaux. That is that Citroën that was for every man. And they made that for decades in Paris, and you saw them all over the place. He was trying to do in that house what the Duchavaux had done in the world of an automobile. And people responded in ways he did not expect. They closed up those ground level gardens and instead made them interior spaces because they wanted more room. Sometimes a little more room, sometimes a lot more room. But there were many, many modifications of those buildings in a very short period of time at the beginning of their life. Many of them, as I said, have now been restored, even to the original colors. Some people can't stomach the colors, but they brought them back as white houses. They're all individually owned because they were sort of condominiumized. So each individual worker owned his own house, and they were able to do whatever they wanted with them. Here you can see some people have put really fancy little, Art Nouveau flourishes, completely different doors, windows than were there originally. Some of them are incredibly derelict and look terrible. Some of them semi-derelict, so they're in all stages of repair. And then some of them have absolutely been meticulously put back in the original condition. Now, the thing that had to go through LeCorbusier's mind is, wow, I'm doing this for these workers, and something's not clicking here. Now, interestingly enough, these buildings, which are right next door and were done at the same time, they have continuously stayed just like that for the whole period. So you can see aerial photographs of them shortly after they were built, and they look just like this, and they're in beautiful condition, and nobody changed them. But Le Corbusier's houses got jerked back and forth in many different ways. So as an architect, wow, what do you do and what do you think about that? And actually, Le Corbusier had a very famous quotation where he said about Pesach, he said, if architecture and life are in conflict, it's architecture that's wrong and it's life that's right. And he saw that as a failure. He made mistakes at Pesach. And after the 1920s, he did not continue to build these kinds of buildings. He changed significantly. And I think he's beginning now to emphasize other aspects of his theory and use the same principles that he was using before, but in different ways as he emphasized other aspects of his theory. So Roman numeral 4 that we have in our notes is on emotion. So how do people react to these things emotionally? And he says the purpose of construction is to make things hold together, of architecture to move us. Architectural emotion exists when the work rings within us in tune with the universe whose laws we obey, recognize, and respect. Now, my interpretation of LeCorbusier in this period is that he had a kind of awakening to a more emotional side of looking at architecture, which was there in Toward a New Architecture, but became emphasized much more really in the immediate work thereafter, but throughout his later career. So you can see very shortly thereafter in 1935, he's doing the Weekend House here. You know, it's got all of those qualities that we were talking about before. It definitely has the roof garden, it has the concrete frame, it has the expression of the structure, it has the geometric clarity, it has the abstraction. It's a beautiful plan where it's kind of a perfect 9-square grid with 1 element, 2 elements, 3 elements there. But now there's more emotion involved. He's making it of much more tactile materials, glass blocks, brick, and he's using a structural system that is vaults, 3 different vaults as they rest on those bearing walls through there. This would have been plywood, so it'd be rich, warm colored plywood, tile floor, brick walls, and really quite a more emotional kind of feeling in the building, but still concurrent with it being very rational, very logical, very geometrical, many of the things you could see in those earlier houses. So I think the emotion is coming through much more solidly. The other thing that we see him doing, which was in Toward a New Architecture, but came to be a major force in the later work, he always said the plan is the generator. This is Roman numeral number 5. Without a plan, you have lack of order and willfulness. So he wanted that plan order. Some of those earlier buildings maybe were not quite as orderly in plan as he began to emphasize in the 30s and thereafter. The plan was not a pretty thing to be drawn. For him, it was an abstraction again, but it was very, very important in generating the character of the architecture. And a good example of that is the Villa Sotheby's, and now we're getting into the 1950s. This was an incredible house that he did in India, in Ahmedabad. This was done in a compound in Ahmedabad where there's a wall around maybe 20 houses that are owned by wealthy families. And so the security is on the outside of the compound. And within the compound, you don't really have to even shut your door, lock your door, anything. There's safety within there. So he makes a house that is always connected to the gardens. And Ahmedabad is like a tropical paradise, beautiful, lush vegetation everywhere. So he's really pointing you always out to the garden and the area out here. And the plan becomes organized by this structural system of walls that go along here that have vaults over them, as we saw in the Weekend House, made of very tactile materials. The order he's talking about in the plan, not willful, but there's the great order set out by the structural system. And then that can accommodate the car at some point. It can accommodate Mama Sotheby's large living space over here, or some of her children, their individual living spaces over here. It's a very large extended family. But again, that notion of the plan having in it order, but also great emotion in it. All of these spaces sort of ordered by the structural system, but always drawing your eye out to the garden. The vaults always pointing you to the garden. And honestly, this one is, the photos don't do it justice. This is a really amazing house. The kind of appropriateness it has to Ahmedabad and that climate and the garden and the order of it, but yet the emotion that's there. It seems to almost perfectly sort of embody all these things. Then the sixth and final point that I want to talk about from the notes is talking about construction as a source of expression. And a couple of quotes here. He says, "The time is ripe for construction, not foolery." He says, "One commonplace among architects, the younger ones, the construction must be shown." So way back in 1923, he's saying we should be getting inspiration from construction, from the way things are made, what they're made out of, and how they're put together. So at the same time, he's doing the Villa Sotheby, and he's doing that out of brick, and that construction is very much generating the kind of building it is. Just down the way on a very different site that doesn't have a garden that it's opening out to, but is high on a hill, we get the Villa Schoten. And the Villa Schoten is made of concrete, not of brick, of concrete, a building that's meant to get up and look out. And so the architecture is, again, coming very much from the materials and the construction. And in this case, again, dealing with the climate of India, but in a very different way. Whereas the Villa Sotheby kept it kind of cool and low and cave-like. This one uses these brise-soleil elements, these sun shading elements, to then protect an open space behind it, and then the house itself behind that. So he's making little microclimates all around that will be cooler and will allow breezes to come into the house. And very much built on orientation. The west facade, very, very blank, but then the south facade where you could shade the sun, allow it to come in the wintertime, but keep it out in the summertime. It becomes the porous, much more open facade. And then putting the sort of vegetation up into the building there. Again, plan is the generator. You definitely see the structural system tracking through, but again, a free plan, able to adjust those partitions different ways. And always conscious of physical forces, the sun and how you're dealing with the sun. And the concrete really making the character of the building, the scale of the building, the color, the texture, the shape, everything in it. Even the way you put windows in are very much based on how you can do something in concrete that you couldn't do in another material. And then just to show the power of material, contrast the Villa Schoten, which another one done at about the same time, the Pavillon Heidi Weber house in Zurich, which is made of a different material. And so, of course, it's a completely different building. It's hard to believe the same architect did the Villa Schoten, that concrete building, and at about the same time is doing the Heidi Weber house, which is a completely different material. But the instance required different materials and different construction. In this case, you want a building that's very, very open. It's in a park. It's meant to have exhibits and communicate with the area around. But many of those 5 points from the very beginning are still there. We still definitely have the roof garden up the top there. We have the free plan. We have the free elevation that's able, because it's not structural, it's able to do anything. It's up, in some ways, up on pilotis in that the ground floor is able to be completely opened up in many instances. And again, a beautiful expression of building in steel and the ability of steel to cantilever and to make these bold structural moves. And then all of the making of the building, the construction of the building down below here is partitioning, clearly made out of something that has no structural capability. The steel is doing the big job, and all of those little infill elements are lighter, more delicate. And then where you do build in concrete, that gets a completely different expression in the ramp that takes you up to the roof garden. So the bottom line of this talk is to get us thinking about LeCorbusier's ideas, his philosophies, his theory, and to let us think not just, okay, that's the way he applied it in 1923, but how did he emphasize one thing more and another thing less? How did he have continuity of those ideas? Did he reject any of those ideas? How did they move over a career? In some ways, he's very different from Sullivan. The theory we got from Sullivan was at a mature point in his career. Le Corbusier formulated that theory pretty early in his career after an explicit effort to do that, and then had a long career following it where he found different ways to apply that. And part of what I think Le Corbusier teaches us is that theory doesn't mean one look or one style. That's a whole other thing, is style. That's not what theory is about. Theory is about principles that can be applied in many different ways, as Le Corbusier did over a long career. Okay, see you in class.